Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is Scott Bradfield. This is part two of the taste test episode of the bathtub, in which we basically try to understand, for no reason other than that it just came to me, why I was having trouble when I was getting bored with Under the Volcano, and I couldn't quite drag myself into the tub with another hour of this guy walking around town drinking. Um, I started reading Coming Up for Air 19, I don't never know the years of these. I want to say 38, 39 Orwell novel from my collect. I had the complete Orwell, the Peter Davidson edited 20 years ago. And it's the only complete contemporary writer I have, I think. I mean, I have complete editions of Brian Moore and all that stuff, and Richard Yates, but it's the only one I have actually the complete edited thing, and I quite value this set, even though it's filled with a lot of unimportant stuff. But the novel Coming Up for Air, and why did I suddenly like it? Okay, um, I have a long, complex, and not complex, a long and fraught, long and enjoyable history of reading Orwell. I couldn't get through Animal Farm as a kid, and I never finished. I couldn't read it in 1984 when I was a kid. I found him kind of boring, and I became a fan of his and loved Orwell when I read his non-fictional books, such as Homage to Catalonia and Road to Wigan Pier, and those kind of, he called them urban rides, these sort of repertorial adventures in the world. Down and Out in Paris and London, which was published as his first novel, was really basically based on all these crappy jobs he had. His novels always struck me as interesting, and they just didn't quite work for me. He's not a great novelist, but as I've gotten older, I've started to go back and enjoy even parts of 1984, which is kind of a brilliant book. I'm finally beginning to concede late in my life. And some of his other novels, which I did enjoy, Keep the Aspidistra Flying. I sort of like the one about the girl whose name is a clergyman's daughter. It's a little too uh, worked out. But it was always his essays I loved. Still, along the way, I've read his novels once in a while. And for various reasons, I decided to pick up Coming Up for Air. And I really just wanted to read this. And I didn't want to read the Lowry. And I was trying to think of some of the reasons that I did like it. It's not a great novel. It's sort of a minor novel. But many of the things that he does as a novelist that Lowry doesn't do. And that is that he has a sense of the physicality of his characters' lives. And the way they think and they look at things are not just these kind of abstract, maundering, philosophical things that happen in Lowry, but they're always based on these, like Orwell's essays, on these kind of really physical, obsessively fascinated with the cost of things and how things are done for Orwell. And he does those really well. Uh, I just remember the opening line. The idea really came to me the day I got my new false teeth. Now, I really wanted a sentence like that somewhere in Lowry. And that notion of the way the physical life of this guy named George Bowling, it's about a man in his middle age. World War II is about to start. He's looking around himself, listening to all the bullshit propaganda. This is well before 1984 was written. And when Orwell was sympathetic, obviously, to the British position and with Germany coming at them. And yet, at the same time, he just sees all this propaganda bullshit of making kids march around the streets and act like they're going to save England and so forth. And his real concern with all that bullshit. But George Bowling is just a middle class, slightly intelligent, but not particularly interesting man who writes with the clarity of Orwell. And from the very first moment, we have the picture of this man, middle-aged, who's got a set of false teeth. And from then on, the whole book is about that, about a man adjusting to the discomforts of his own body. He's fat, he's overweight. He talks quite a bit about how he knows he's fat, and he also knows that being fat makes him invisible to people, and also makes it easy for him to work with them and sell them things, because he's sort of a salesman. And George Bowling lives a really boring, modest life. He has a couple of kids he doesn't really like. He lives in the suburbs. And while he's telling the story, he's looking at the world as if it's about to come to an end. as we are looking at our world today. So it kind of really it has a real urgency and impact. It's very much a reflective novel, so not much happens in it. It starts off basically going through the guy's day, as I recall, and he's made a little bit of money. How much money you have in your pocket is always important to Orwell. And he's not particularly wild about his wife, but his wife is incredibly good at figuring out what he's up to. He really gets it. He can't lie to this girl because whatever he does, she catches him. And he's a big fat kind of loser guy. And he starts to, in the middle of the book, he starts to think, well, the world's coming to an end. And he goes on a lovely little reflection about his childhood growing up out in the outskirts of London. It reminds me a lot of some of the H.G. Wells novels of kind of suburban grocers and so forth, like Kipps. Was it Kipps? And then the other one, The History of Mr. Polly. And Wells was a big influence on Orwell. I guess they knew each other for a bit. So it's not surprising. There's something about that kind of the physicality of this world and the way this guy lives and his reflections on the absurdities, because he does recognize the absurdities. In the course of it, Orwell does what he always does really well, which he's always good at finding the pleasures of life. So, many of his essays, he'll talk about how much it's nice to smoke, or how to drink tea, where it makes things feel good and taste good. And the physical pleasures of life just always are well handled by Orwell. And in the course of coming up for air, we have several places where this kid, as he's growing up, going to the sweet shop, and he'll remember the details of the sweet shop and the smells of the sweet shops and what candies were there and what you do and what boys did when they were running around kind of disregarded by their parents. And he does that stuff, that sensual life, really well. And then there's a long passage about fishing. Now, when he was a young man, he loved to fish, and what kind of fish he would fish for, and how he would fish, and how they would make the hooks. And then when he went into World War I, he was a soldier, and he does all that stuff so well that you just really want to get back to it. And they're like almost little bits. They're not really, the novel doesn't feel that urgent, but the passages are all good. I just kept wanting to get back to George Bowley. There's also a little. I'll read one or two little passages. He talks about how at one point he's talking about the war and what the war does to people after World War I when they come back. I like this little paragraph. I'll give you a little taste of Orwell. The war did extraordinary things to people, and what was more extraordinary than the way it killed people was the way it sometimes didn't kill them. That's a great Orwell line. It was like a great flood rushing you along to death, and suddenly it would shoot you up some backwater where you'd find yourself doing incredible and pointless things and drawing extra pay for them. You come back to these stupid jobs. There were labor battalions making roads across the desert that didn't lead anywhere. There were chaps marooned on oceanic islands to look out for German cruisers which had been sunk years earlier. There were ministries of this and that with armies of clerks and typists which went on existing years after their function had ended by a kind of inertia. People were shoved into meaningless jobs and then forgotten by the authorities for years on end. This was what happened to myself, or very likely I wouldn't be here. The whole sequence of events is rather interesting. And he goes on to talk about how he gets out of the war by getting the stupid desk job. He's a great sense of the ironies and the ridiculousnesses of life as well as the pleasures of life, and he never misses an opportunity to explore those. The other thing I wanted to just briefly mention is this is definitely, when I'm about halfway through it, one of the pleasures that Orwell writes about so well is the pleasures of books and reading the books. And he talks about 2 or 3 passages in Bowling's life when, as a child, he'd go fishing and he'd read these, like, the boys' weeklies that Orwell talks about so beautifully in some of his essays. And he talks about Dickens very well and Kipling. But this is like the boys' magazines, and then later on adventure stories. And there's a great passage about midway through the book about how when you come back from the war and you have these really bad jobs and you're working all day doing mindless stuff, that he couldn't read anymore. It's just all the stuff we talk about. It's just so hard to read for that type of selfish pleasure. Orwell's whole interest, and you really see this you'll see this in 1984, is that these selfish pleasures And this ability to go off and just not think about the fucking mess of things for some periods of time is really what kind of saves the human race. That's Orwell's argument. I think I've inherited that argument from him. The pleasures that we sometimes are embarrassed about are the ones that kind of make our lives worth living and which actually make us willing to fight for that life in a way. And of course, what happens in 1984, the one that most people know, is they just is the selfish sex, the sex that Winston and Julia find. They're just having sex. They're not in love. There's nothing. They're not going to have children. They're just having a good time, and that makes them want to fight. And when they don't have anything to fight for, that's when everybody is just completely destroyed. And so this early book is just about the pleasures of reading. Large parts of it are just the pleasures of reading. It basically saves George Bowling. And the last third of the book, it sort of peters out, but it's a lovely book. The third part of the book, Bowling goes back to his childhood home to see how it's just been overrun by modern industrial England and what's happened to his old town and the places he used to fish. And the ending of the book just kind of peters out. But which is one of the reasons why I think I think Orwell was not much of a novelist, and he's not a great novelist, but they're really pleasurable books. And I really recommend Coming Up for Air, particularly while we're watching the world come to an end, possibly even worse than the one that he was contemplating in 1938, 39. Okay, so if I had a choice, I'd definitely take that back in the bathtub. My taste test, I have no real reason to say this. I wouldn't take that back in the bathtub. I'll never take that into the bathtub until I die. But I might well live long enough to reread. I'll have to forget it. In 10 years, I'll have forgotten completely what happened in this book. I can go back and read it again. All right. I'd recommend Coming Up for Air, George Orwell. Bye. Okay, I don't ever turn it off on time.